Hey, welcome back to the channel. So, this video is a little different. I'm writing an article for Dynasty League Football, DLF, where all my written content goes. And I have to do an extremely nerdy section. It's all pretty nerdy, looking at wide receiver breakouts, when wide receivers break out. It's a primary topic, but inside that, there's what indicates a wide receiver might break out after they play their rookie season. So I was using various statistics, trying to show what the average is and how predictive they are and how well they correlate. See how nerdy it gets real quick. To their production in year 2 and 3, if you look at the average of those 2 years at least. And I created tables and stuff, and I was like, you know what? It's going to be easier if DLF will let me just drop a video. Because it's not like it's not important, but there's already a lot of reading to do, and there are graphs and charts and lists of names. And I thought maybe if I could just do this small section as a video explaining how I tested numbers and why I'm using the numbers I'm using to look at breakouts, instead of having to write an entire other article within another article, that would be neat. So we'll see if they let me, but either way I thought it might make an interesting video to anyone listening to my little nerd channel. Now, first off the rip, you gotta know, as I say pretty often, I'm very much a fake nerd. I'm not a statistician, I'm not a mathematician, I'm learning statistics for the purposes of winning fantasy football games, which is weird, to be honest, but also know your source, right? I've tried to learn as much as I can, but this is by no means reflective as the only or the best way, but it's how I'm going about it, and it's why I'm using the stats that I use. And like I always like to drop the data I'm using so other people can look at it to see if they can do better or find something I missed. The same goes for the process of how I come to my conclusions. And so that's kind of this video, how I tested stats from rookie seasons to what they did in year 2 and 3, the most likely breakout window, especially dynasty value window. And what those results say just on the whole. So how predictive and also sticky are stats from rookie seasons, and how I went about finding a baseline understanding. Not an advanced, I'm not saying it's the only way or the best way, but at least a baseline understanding of what their rookie production can tell us if they played a decent amount of games at least, which I'll get to. So, let's do that. I'm going to flip over to the other screen now, and there'll be a spreadsheet. Try your hardest not to fall asleep, unless you like to sleep to YouTube videos. I'm here for that. That's cool. I'm your background noise. Like I'll do impressions of whales and stuff. I swear. Just take a nap. It's fine. I don't know what that was. Hey, I'm down here now. That's pretty cool. I like it when I get smaller. So, essentially, what I did to test rookie stats to find a baseline understanding of what rookie stats can tell me is I got a list of players drafted from 2000, so if they were drafted in the year 2000 all the way to present day, 2020 class, right? If you're listening in the future, that isn't present day, but the 2020 class is the last one to go through the NFL draft. So I just got a list of all of those rookie wide receivers, and then I eliminated every season after the third season, and I averaged their stats, and I've got a list of 46 different stats here in this data set that I thought were relevant for wide receivers. So everything from target share to total opportunities to receiving yards, targets, yards per reception, air yards, just the 46 I had in my database that seemed at all relevant to wide receiver production. I just collected all of those together for years 1 to 3 for all rookies from 2000 to 2020. Then I removed every player who didn't record stats all 3 years. So if they were injured their second year, or they didn't even play a second year because they were undrafted and it was just like a momentary thing in their first year, I just took them out of the sample because I want to know broadly what players who play all 3 years can tell us about what rookie stats can tell us. And so I just removed everyone that didn't play 3 years. And then removed everyone who didn't play 8 games, at least 8 games in the rookie season. It's not that good players didn't go on to be good after playing less than 8 games. It's just that under 8 games, I find that a significant threshold for them acquiring stats that tell us something about the player and not just random variance. Now, 8 games isn't some kind of meridian line where they have to play 8 games, or I don't know. In fact, I'd rather a full season, but we want to keep as large a sample as possible while still having a good idea that these stats reflect something they were doing and not just they caught a few random 100-yard balls in a single game in the rookie season. So I want the average of at least 8 games, essentially. Then what I did is I calculated their stats, their average stats for year 2 and 3. And that's these columns over here in orange, if you can see them. They're just laid right next to them. So the ones in black, and you don't have to read them, don't worry about it. Like, it's not that kind of nerd. Like, you don't have to be memorizing these things as you go. I'm just explaining how I laid it out. So all these statistics, there's 46 different statistics. The ones in the black columns are the stats they recorded in their rookie season. And the stats that are recorded on average between year 2 and 3 are these orange columns. So you see here, this player was position rank 174 at the wide receiver position. Well, yeah, the wide receiver position, through his 2nd and 3rd year. That's pretty bad. And in his rookie season, he was wide receiver 77. So it's a significant drop off. So that stat, that finishing wide receiver 77 in his rookie season, did not tell us a lot about what he was going to do on average year 2 and 3, right? But we're also looking at a larger sample than that to see if it can tell us something more than anything else. Now, the test I used is called R-squared. It's becoming pretty much the standard test in fantasy football. Again, it's not the only one. It's the one we most commonly refer to. And essentially, it tries to calculate the amount of variance that a stat accounts for between these two stats, their rookie year stats and their 2nd and 3rd year stats. So it's not predicting, it's not like that wide receiver 77 season predicted that wide receiver 174 over the next 2 seasons. It's telling us how much variance between the one set of data, the rookie data, and their year 2 and 3 stats there is. Is there a lot? Is there a little? Now, already you're asleep. I can feel it. If I knew how to do whale noises, I would do it. But think of it this way. It's not telling us, it's not predicting their actual position rank or target share. It's telling us on average how much their rookie season could tell us about what they were going to do on average between year 2 and 3. And it's that simple. Now, you don't have to understand R-squared results or to look at a lot of them in this context, because the entire idea is I've collected all the rookie stats that I have available from RotoViz and publicly available data. Now, there are routes and other stats I just simply don't have access to, so I can't test all of those. But since we're comparing them to each other, it's not they have to reach a certain number to be good. It's how do they compare to each other. So if I'm looking at a rookie season, a player's rookie season, which stat tells me the most about what they're going to do in their future? Is it touchdowns? Is it yards? Is it yards per reception? And that's what we're looking for, not the stat that tells us everything, but from everything that we know, what tells us the most relative to each other about what's going to happen for that player. Now, as always, with averages and R-squared testing, I think it's important to remember we're looking at a strong fallacy of the average here, in that this is telling us what's most commonly true, but this is the broad view look. You should always dig into an individual player, how they looked, how good they were they, how they made these numbers. And that's where tape comes in, to be fair, but it's also where looking at those players' individual stats and the context in which they were created can tell us more than the average can. So this is, I'm not a good enough or a big enough nerd to be able to show you stats that tell you everything you need to know. But they're telling us on that broad level, this is what it should tell us. And then from there, we dig into the individual player to see if there's extra context or extra reason we should trust or not trust that average. And that's why I'm doing it. I'm trying to create this baseline of which stats should I look at, and then I want to dig into an individual player to get an understanding of if it's true or not, essentially, if that is a good thing or a bad thing compared to another player who scored higher or lower in any particular stat. Alright. So that's what I did, and essentially it created this table. So this is, again, all players since 2000, drafted since 2000 to 2020 who played 3 years. So frankly, no one since 2017 draft class could really be included in it, because you have to have played 3 years and played 8 games in your rookie season to be included in the sample. That created a sample of 283 players, as you can see in this fancy little box here. That's the total number of individual players I've got in the sample, and I think that's a pretty decent sample size. Now, if I didn't reduce by 8 games, I have like 417 players in there, which is a better sample. But again, I've already said I want to know if a player played 1 game and therefore only has 2% of the target share. I don't think that's a fair comparison to someone that played 8 games and had 2% of the target share. So I think 8 games to players who played 16 games is a fairer comparison. So I just removed everyone that had played less than 8 games. And that's important to know if you're really nerdy about it and want to know and create a better sample size for yourself. Alright. So, what is this table saying? Essentially, these 2 columns are the average stats across all these stats listed, all 46 stats, that players recorded in their rookie season if they went on to have at least 1 top 24 season. So good players, essentially. Players we wanted in fantasy because they finished in, the top 24, right? Eventually, at least. And this is what they did on average. Remember, the average can be a little bit of a lie, a little bit of a fallacy. But that's the average stat for players that were drafted in the first 3 rounds and players that were drafted in the round 4 to undrafted free agents. Now, the reason I separated that out is because, as I showed in the articles, there's a distinct difference in the way a player's career plays out, depending on where they're drafted. One, more players break out if they're drafted rounds 1 to 3. And if they break out after round 4 or undrafted, their career tends to have a slower burn. They tend to break out at a later time. And so it felt reasonable when looking at rookie stats to have that separated out. You shouldn't expect 600 plus yards from a player drafted in the 4th round and then say that's whether they're good or bad. Because they're drafted later, they probably have a slightly lower threshold for what is good as a rookie because they have less draft capital and less opportunity for opportunity, I guess. And so they have a slightly lower threshold. Now, in raw receiving yards, you can see the difference here is about 100 yards, which still means that players drafted between round 4 and undrafted get a significant number of yards in rookie seasons, apparently, if they're going to have a top 24 season eventually. Now, again, that's the average. If you look at Tyrell Williams, for example, that's not true. It's also not true of Wes Welker, and so on and so forth. The average lies to us a little bit, but it's a good place to start before we dig into an individual example to decide if we like them as a breakout or not. That just tells us what we're comparing them to, right, when we go and look at the actual context. So that's what these first 2 columns are. The next columns are the extremely nerdy things. This is those 2 sets of data I was telling you about, the black columns versus the orange columns, using that R-squared test. So, what I've done is sorted it by the average of these 3 scores. Now, I tested it against itself, so in this case, yards per team attempt per game, versus yards per team attempt in their 2nd and 3rd season, and that's the correlation of it. 0.43 is how well it correlates. Now, if that number makes no sense to you, remember we're just judging them in context of each other, so it doesn't really matter if you know what 0.43 means. It's just that it's higher than 0.42, that's what matters. But you can also convert them to percentages in your head, so that's 43%, that's 42%, this is 39%, because percentages make more sense to us, I think, sometimes than decimal point values. So they can easily be represented as a percentage as well if it just makes it easier for yourself. Now, when I sorted them by which had the best average score by testing its stickiness, so how well the stat predicted itself, in this column right here, and then how well it explained their points per game over the next 2 years and their expected points per game over the next 2 years. So points per game, I see it as predicting the actual production, how good they were in fantasy. Expected points per game can vary drastically. This is a RotoViz formula, and it essentially calculates how many fantasy points a player should have scored based on the opportunity they received. So you can be more or less efficient on that opportunity. So essentially I'm testing against their production and their opportunity to get a decent idea of what these stats tell us about what players will do in terms of whether they will rise in target share or opportunity in general, or rise in production. There's a slight difference there, so I wanted to run it against both. What else would I say about that? There was something. Oh yeah, speaking of, this isn't the only way of looking at it. One article that I really love, he actually did a series on it. Blair Andrews from RotoViz actually looked at rookie stats in a very different way. He looked at the percentage of players who actually get more or less opportunity if they are good or bad in a stat. So that's a slightly different way of looking at rookie stats. This is by no means the way or the only way. It's just what occurred to me to find a good idea to isolate stats that were useful for identifying rookies who may be more likely to break out in the next 2 years after we see their rookie seasons. Alright, so yards per team pass attempt is scoring the highest. I'm not going to use that in my article so heavily because it's not one people are that familiar with. I like it a lot. I've been using it increasingly. But I think people will be more interested in points per game and receiving yards because they are pretty much as good as yards per team attempt per game, but you don't have to calculate it. You can just go look up a rookie player's points per game or a rookie player's receiving yards on Pro Football Reference or anywhere else. And I think that leads to a more direct path into people getting a good idea of where the player they're interested in falls in terms of whether they had a good or a bad rookie season. And so those are the two stats I'm actually going to focus on more heavily in my article. Because again, these scores are relatively similar in the top 6. And these two stats, I think people are already comfortable with. We can look them up anywhere. You don't need a database like I've got. You don't need to get behind a paywall. You're probably already pretty aware of if Chase Claypool had a good or a bad points per game, or how many receiving yards he had. And that immediately plots him in your head in terms of if he had a good or a bad rookie season, and whether that's likely to translate into year 2 and 3. Based on this testing, at least. And so those are the two I'm going to run with. But since we're doing a video, why not point out that yards per team attempt is actually technically better on average when you're testing across all three. It's stickiness, it's points per game, and expected points per game. And I think that's significant because points per game, frankly, should predict itself a little better than most stats because it's the same type of stat, right? In the same way that expected points per game predicts its or explains the variance in itself over the next 2 years better than most of the stats. And so that just kind of makes sense to me. But the fact yards per team pass attempt technically beats points per game in terms of predicting or rather explaining points per game over the next 2 years is actually particularly interesting to me. Also, since we know volume stats are overall good, and a per stat, like yards per team attempt, I keep struggling with saying that for some reason, has efficiency rolled into it. I think that's how it works. The fact that percentage of team opportunities, a slightly obscure stat, but I think most people are pretty well aware of their players' percentage, or market share for that matter, of their opportunities in their rookie season, especially if you take on like Laviska Shenault or Chase Claypool had a certain number of rushing attempts, which means they increase in terms of total touches for the team touches, which is an overall positive thing for those players who have that in their skill set. I think it's interesting that that turns up in the top 4 scores here as well. Alright, so that's what I did. That's why I'm talking about the stats that I'm talking about. And this is one way of calculating an average for deciding whether a player had a good or a bad rookie year. Why don't I finish it by looking at the 2020 class rookie stats and comparing them across yards per team pass attempt, which is actually where I started because I forgot I was on that tab when I started the video. But this is it. This is the 2020 rookie class. Wide receiver edition, sorted by yards per team pass attempt per game. So Justin Jefferson had the best one, because, you know, he had a top 12 season and he was phenomenal. Brandon Ayuk, interestingly enough, comes in second as a rookie in 2020, followed by CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Jerry Jeudy, and then Chase Claypool and Laviska Shenault. Denzel Mims is an interesting entry here, I think, but, you know. The other thing to note is we also found an average. The average of rookies drafted round 1 to 3 is about 0.78 if they go on to have a breakout. Now remember, there's a little bit of a lie in an average number like that, because Vincent Jackson probably very likely didn't score that and yet still went on to be a great player, and there are other examples of that as well. But it gives you an idea, right? So I'll point out that Denzel Mims is the prime meridian here, or the line where we fall below that average. So Denzel Mims had a bad rookie season based on yards per team attempt compared to the average of players who go on to have top 24 seasons. But he's also pretty close to that average line. And also, if you like Darnell Mooney, who I do a lot because he's a later round pick, and I love all later round picks, 4th round pick, was expected to get less if we compare him to the average over here of 0.65. And yet last year, he had 0.65. So he's right on that line, especially when you adjust for the draft capital that he had. So that's overall positive for him as well. In fact, everyone that's close to the average, you could say, you know, there's a range there because it is an average. And also, just because your favorite player, whether it's Jalen Reagor, as is probably mine, or KJ Hamler, who's another person in the 2020 class I liked a lot, just because they're falling decently below that average, doesn't mean it can't happen. It's just a way of measuring how likely it is to happen compared to past prospects. So obviously, Brandon Ayuk might well be the player you're more interested in because he compares much better to past prospects in terms of what he did in his rookie season. But that doesn't mean that Jalen Reagor won't do it. It just might mean he's slightly less likely to do it than Brandon Ayuk, who finished as a wide receiver 35 last year, so still not quite yet into the top 24. Now, based on some other trends we've seen, and I'll lay out in that article, there is some reason to be excited by this, especially for Brandon Ayuk, CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Jerry Jeudy, because based on their falling and rising ADP, some of these guys are coming out of value, and the fact that they might well compare well to past prospects while falling in value means that there might be a potential buy opportunity for these young players who had decent rookie seasons, apparently based on a stat that does a good job compared to other stats of telling us if they're going to break out or if they in fact had a good rookie season. But again, gonna lay more of that out in the article. I guess you may want to look at some of this. I mean, if you're really nerdy and you listen to this for the whole 20 minutes, I will work on putting that sample and this table into a spreadsheet, uploading it and putting it in the links in the description below, and I'll post it on Patreon and I'll put it in the article as well, so that you can look for yourself, like which of my favorite rookies from the past, how did they do in these stats, and you can just get an idea of that fallacy, whether a player is over or under these averages can be a lie, and to get more familiar with it and basically what these testing results are telling us. But that's it. 20 minutes was a lot easier than writing another 500 words, I personally feel. So, yeah, that's how I tested the stats. That's why I'm talking about those two stats primarily in the article. And, not that's the best or the only, but it's the best way I know of trying to find which stats tell me the most about what's going to happen in these players' futures. Hello, I'm big again. Anyway, let me know if you liked the video, or if you didn't, or if you want to see more about it, or please get that link out, because I really want to dig into your sample and prove to you that you're wrong. I would love to hear about it in the comments section, on the article, in the video, on Twitter, or wherever. And appreciate you checking it out. Thanks very much. And I will talk to you again next time. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that article. If you're here from reading that article, I appreciate it. Because writing articles is hard, especially when you have the typing skills that I do. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Bye.